There is a very common belief that has haunted millions of people after leaving a narcissistic relationship. I was wrong. I was blind. I chose the wrong person. That belief takes root so deeply that it becomes a silent sentence you pass on yourself each time you remember how wholeheartedly you loved, how much you endured, how deeply you trusted, how much you sacrificed. But if we pause for a moment, long enough to stop viewing this story through the shame of the ego and begin to see it through the lens of depth psychology, another truth slowly emerges. A truth that is uncomfortable yet liberating. Loving a narcissist was never your mistake. It was the moment your soul began its awakening. Carl Jung once said that no awakening occurs without passing through darkness, and a relationship with a narcissist is one of the most severe dark chambers of human life. A place where every illusion about love, about the self, about being seen, chosen, and validated is stripped away without mercy. You did not enter that relationship because you were weak or lacking in worth. You entered it because there was a part of you, a part unseen, unhealed, that was searching for answers. The narcissist does not appear as a destroyer at the beginning. They appear as a perfect mirror, reflecting back the light, depth, devotion, and longing for connection that already existed within you. And for that very reason, your soul recognized them before your conscious mind understood what was happening. The tragedy of this relationship is not that you loved the wrong person, but that you loved from a part of yourself that had no boundaries, no inner sovereignty. In Jungian language, this is the moment when the ego still operates through projection, while the self, the whole and integrated being, remains asleep behind layers of adaptation, sacrifice, and excessive empathy. The narcissist, with their inflated persona and disowned shadow, becomes the perfect catalyst for this process. They did not steal your soul. They forced you to see where you had given your life force away. So if today you find yourself sitting with feelings of brokenness, confusion, self-blame, and exhaustion, understand this. These emotions are not evidence of failure. They are signs that an old structure within you is collapsing. They are the cost of an ego that can no longer sustain its illusions, and of a soul that is reclaiming its voice. This story was never meant to end in bitterness. It was meant to open another door, one where you no longer love to be chosen, no longer exist as a mirror for others to look into, but begin to live as a person with sovereignty, with boundaries, and with inner truth. And from this moment on, the question is no longer, why did I love a narcissist? But what have I awakened to within myself through that love? This is not their story. This is the story of your return to yourself. To truly understand why you were drawn into a narcissistic relationship, we must step away from the familiar explanations of conventional morality, right or wrong, wise or foolish, and enter the territory Carl Jung called unconscious dynamics. At this level, human beings do not love through reason, nor do they choose through conscious will. We are pulled toward one another by parts of ourselves that have not yet been fully lived, fully seen, or fully integrated within. A narcissist does not enter your life in the form of a manipulator. They arrive as a promise, a very subtle promise. I see you, I choose you, I make you feel special. And that feeling is the key point. Not because you lacked love, but because you had grown accustomed to seeing yourself through the eyes of others. In many cases, those who feel the strongest pull toward narcissists are people with deep inner lives, sensitive, empathic, emotionally rich, who learned early on how to survive by adapting, pleasing, and becoming the good child in other people's emotional worlds. In Jungian language, this is the moment when your persona, the adaptive mask, has been working for too long. You know how to listen, understand, accommodate, and heal, but in exchange, your own deepest needs are pushed down into the dark region Jung called the shadow. The narcissist, with their inflated and captivating persona, unconsciously touches that exact point. They do not love you in a mature sense. They reflect back to you a feeling of existing, of mattering, of being recognized. something you had given outward again and again, but never truly held for yourself. This is where what Jung called an unconscious contract is formed. You do not sign it with words, but with psychic energy. You give them vitality, depth, and emotional presence. They give you the illusion that you are finally being seen. In the early stage, this relationship carries the feeling of destiny, because it activates very ancient layers of the soul, the longing to unite, to merge, to come home in the gaze of another. But the problem is this: it is not a union between two mature selves, but a collision between unhealed parts. You are not drawn to the narcissist because they are strong, but because they outwardly express qualities you were once forced to suppress within yourself. Their extreme confidence masks a fear of abandonment. Their need for control meets your tendency to take excessive responsibility. Their emotional coldness activates your instinct to make things better. And within that spiral, you slowly come to believe that if you love enough, understand deeply enough, endure long enough, this relationship will become real love. What you do not realize is that you are trying to heal another person using parts of yourself that have never been healed. Jung emphasized that we are not wounded by what is foreign, but by what is unconsciously familiar. The narcissist awakens something very old within you, perhaps from childhood, from early relationships, where love was bound to tension, insecurity, and the need to prove worthiness. This attraction, therefore, is not an accident. It is a signal that your soul is standing at an important crossroads. Either continue living through persona and projection, or descend into the shadow to reclaim yourself. For this reason, the first part of this story is not a tragedy, but an invitation. An invitation to face the truth that you did not love because you were foolish. You loved because your soul was seeking wholeness. And it is from this point that the awakening journey, however painful, truly begins. After the initial attraction phase, the relationship with a narcissist does not collapse immediately. On the contrary, it transforms quietly, as if an invisible door has just closed behind you. This is the moment when love, something meant to nourish, begins to turn into a psychological laboratory, where the deepest and darkest layers of the unconscious are activated. And what is crucial to understand is this: you did not accidentally enter this phase. It is the inevitable next step of the unconscious contract established from the beginning. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when the shadow begins to rise into consciousness, when the narcissist's glamorous persona no longer has the energy to sustain the idealized performance. What they have disowned within, shame, emptiness, rage, envy, feelings of worthlessness, starts to seek an outlet. But the shadow never appears in its own face. It always needs a place to inhabit. And you, with your high capacity to tolerate emotion, with your tendency towards self-questioning and self-blame, unconsciously become the perfect container. This is where projection and introjection operate fully. The narcissist projects onto you the parts they cannot face. You're too sensitive, you make everything complicated, you're the problem. And you, accustomed to keeping the peace and searching for fault within yourself, begin to take these projections in as truth. You do not just hear them, you swallow them. Gradually, their emotional burden becomes your inner weight, while they feel lighter, emptier, and at the same time, more dependent on you. What makes this stage particularly dangerous is not open conflict, but prolonged confusion. There is no single dramatic blow, no moment bad enough to make you leave immediately. Instead, there is ambiguity, closeness followed by distance, affection followed by coldness, apologies followed by denial. Jung called this state psychic confusion, when consciousness is stretched between two conflicting realities. You begin to doubt your own intuition. You remember the good version of them from the beginning, and believe that if you are patient enough, understanding enough, that persona will return. What you do not realize is this: the persona did not disappear, it simply ran out of energy. Within this structure, love is no longer a meeting between two people, but a one-sided emotional regulation cycle. You keep the relationship stable by absorbing instability. You become the emotional regulation system for their inner fluctuations. And here, the relationship begins to function more like an addiction than a bond. When you react, they feel alive. When you suffer, they feel relieved. When you go silent, they panic. Their shadow has found its fuel. Jung warned that when a person refuses to face their shadow, they become possessed by it. What is less often said is this, that shadow does not only possess them, it spreads to those who are close enough. You are not merely loving a person, you are living with their unintegrated darkness. And because you were never taught how to distinguish between what is yours and what belongs to another, you come to believe that carrying this weight is a sign of love, of maturity, of compassion. Part 2 of this story is where many people begin to lose themselves, but it is also where the seed of awakening is planted. For no shadow is activated without serving a deeper purpose. The chaos you are experiencing is not meant to destroy you. It is meant to force you to ask the first and most important question of the inner journey. Is this emotion truly mine? And from the moment that question appears, this relationship no longer holds the same absolute power over you as it once did. There comes a point in a narcissistic relationship when the pain no longer resembles ordinary sadness. It is not just disappointment, not just loneliness, but something deeper and more elusive, as if something inside you is cracking. Many people describe this phase as losing themselves, but through the lens of Carl Jung, this is not a loss, it is a psychological death, the death of an ego structure that has existed long enough to fulfill its role. Before this moment, you still believe that if you change a little more, understand a little more, sacrifice a little more, the relationship will return to what it once was. You still believe the story that if you love enough, everything will be fine. Then there is a very small moment, sometimes just an offhand remark, a look of contempt, a cold silence, that causes that belief to collapse, not because you are angry, but because your soul can no longer deceive itself. Jung called this the moment when consciousness can no longer defend outdated illusions. At this stage, the pain no longer comes from fearing the loss of them, but from beginning to see the truth. And truth always comes with pain, because it requires you to let go of a part of the identity you once equated with yourself. You realize that the love you are trying to preserve does not truly nourish you. You realize that what you have called sacrifice is in fact self-erasure. And the most painful realization is not that they do not change, but that you are starting to see clearly that they cannot change in the way you hoped. In Jungian terms, this is the nigredo stage, the dark phase of the soul's alchemical process. Everything that once gave you a sense of stability collapses. Beliefs, roles, the story of us. You feel empty, disoriented, even guilty for having thoughts of leaving. But nigredo does not appear to punish. It appears when a psychological structure can no longer expand. This pain is a sign that the self is trying to rise beyond the control of the old ego. This is also when the trauma bond begins to reveal itself clearly. You are no longer staying because of love, but because of emotional dependency formed through cycles of tension, release, and hope. Your body becomes addicted to emotional highs and lows as a way to feel alive. Yet, at the same time, a very lucid part of you begins to ask, why do I have to hurt this much in order to be loved? This question does not arise from anger, but from deep exhaustion, a sign that your nervous system has reached its limit. Jung once said that psychological maturity does not come from becoming stronger, but from no longer being able to live in the old ways. And it is precisely here that pain becomes a messenger. It does not tell you to try harder, it tells you to stop. It does not ask you to fix the relationship, it asks you to return to yourself. When pain no longer drives you to cling, but forces you to look inward, the relationship has fulfilled its deepest function, activating awakening. So if you are at a stage where everything hurts, yet you no longer want to argue, no longer want to prove anything, no longer want to save the relationship at all costs, understand this: you are not failing at love. You are crossing the threshold between living in illusion and beginning to live in truth. And although this moment may feel like you are falling apart, on a deeper level, it is precisely when your soul begins to detach from a story that no longer fits, preparing for a more honest, more integrated way of being. After the pain has passed its peak, What happens next is often far quieter than many expect. There is no grand declaration, no dramatic breakup, no sense of victory. Instead, there is a strange state, inner silence, a silence that does not come from understanding everything, but from no longer having the energy to live in contradiction. In Jungian language, this is the moment when the ego stops reacting and the self begins to speak. This moment of awakening often arrives quietly, almost unnoticed. It may be the day you no longer feel compelled to explain your feelings. It may be when you reread old messages and realize you spoke so much, yet were never truly heard. Or simply when the thought, I can't live like this anymore, appears without panic. What matters is not the external action, but the internal shift. You no longer react to keep the relationship alive. Jung called this the transition from a life governed by projection to a life with an inner witness. Before, you existed in the relationship by seeing yourself through the other person's eyes, whether they were satisfied, whether they softened, whether they stayed. But in this moment, a new anchor forms, not in their responses, but in your own lived truth. You begin to trust your experience instead of arguing with it. The silence at this point is not a tactic nor a punishment for the narcissist. It is the natural consequence of withdrawing your psychic energy to where it belongs. You no longer try to make things easier by swallowing your emotions. You no longer need to prove that you are right. In many cases, it is this very silence that confuses a narcissist because they are accustomed to you being the one who reacts, who regulates, who repairs. When you stop, the entire structure of dependency becomes visible. This is also when the first boundary forms, not through words, but through a state of being. You do not need to declare, I am setting boundaries, because the boundary is already present in the way you no longer participate in old loops. Jung saw this as a clear sign of the individuation process, when the ego no longer seeks validation from the outside, but begins to serve inner wholeness. You do not become cold, you become discerning. This awakening is often accompanied by a very subtle sense of loss. You are not only letting go of a person, but also of a version of yourself, the one who believed that loving enough would make everything okay. That letting go hurts, but it is no longer desperate. It feels like a final truth you are finally ready to live with. From this point on, you no longer return to the relationship seeking answers, because you have realized the answers do not reside in them. As you begin to withdraw your energy, stop reacting, stop explaining, and stop seeking validation from the narcissist, a painful yet necessary paradox slowly emerges. It is not that you leave them, but that you step into a psychological space where they cannot exist. This is no longer about right or wrong, love or hate, or who left whom, but about a fundamental difference in inner structure. In the language of Carl Jung, you are entering the process of individuation, and they are not. The narcissist lives through the persona, the mask constructed to conceal an empty and fragile self. Their entire identity depends on external reactions, admiration, fear, attention, or the suffering of others. As long as you react, whether through love or pain, you are still providing them with proof that they exist. But when you become silent with inner sovereignty, that reflective mirror shatters. And this is the place they cannot cross. Individuation requires one condition. The narcissist avoids at all costs facing their own shadow. It demands the acknowledgement of shame, limitation, woundedness, and personal responsibility. For you, pain has forced you into that dark territory. For them, that territory is an existential threat to the ego. So when you change, they do not simply refuse to follow you, they cannot. Every step you take forward is a reminder that they are standing still. This is also why the moment you begin to heal often triggers extreme reactions in the narcissist: hoovering, rage, denial, or smear campaigns. Not because they miss you, but because your peace exposes the emptiness within them. Jung described this as a deep-level narcissistic injury, when the persona is no longer supported by another person and the shadow begins to surge with nowhere to hide. Rather than face it, they retreat, attack, or search for a new mirror. What you need to understand is this: the relationship did not end because you were not patient enough or did not love enough. It ended because two psychological paths diverged. You are learning how to exist without needing to be reflected, They are not. You are learning to take responsibility for your own emotions. They continue to discharge theirs outward. And at this intersection, separation is no longer a personal tragedy, but a natural consequence of inner maturation. There is a very subtle pain at this stage, the pain of realizing that love cannot save everything. You may be able to see their potential, but that potential does not belong to you. Jung emphasized that each person must walk their own path. No one can do another's shadow work for them. When you accept this, you do not become cold or indifferent. You become realistic and free. A subtle yet decisive shift occurs once you accept that the narcissist cannot follow you through the door of awakening. This is the moment you stop viewing the relationship through the question, who was right, who was wrong, and begin to see it through a far deeper question. What was awakened within me? Here you are no longer standing in the position of a victim trying to understand what happened, but stepping into the role of the inner witness, the one who can see the entire process without being submerged in it. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when psychic energy withdraws from projection and returns to the center of the self. Before you existed by reacting to silence, to coldness, to accusations. Each reaction exhausted you further, yet simultaneously kept the old structure running. Now, when you no longer need to react in order to feel that you exist, a different kind of power begins to form, the power of conscious presence. This shift is often accompanied by an initial sense of emptiness. When you are no longer the rescuer, the one who endures, the one who explains, you may feel as though you no longer know who you are. But this very emptiness is the space required for a more authentic identity to emerge. Jung called this the stage where the ego learns to serve the self rather than dominate it. You no longer define yourself by how much others need you, but by how deeply you are rooted in your own truth. At this point, your compassion also changes form. Before, compassion meant endurance, explanation, unconditional forgiveness. Now, compassion becomes discerning. You can see the narcissist's pain without entering it. You can understand their mechanisms without continuing to be part of those mechanisms. This is not a closing of the heart, but the maturation of the heart, when love no longer means self-erasure. This process also marks the end of identification with the old story. You no longer tell this relationship to seek validation, nor do you need to convince anyone that you were hurt. That story has completed its function. Now you carry understanding rather than wounds. And it is this new silence, not silence born of fear, but silence born of having nothing left to prove, that becomes the foundation of inner sovereignty. After you have reclaimed your inner sovereignty, the deepest change does not lie in whether you enter a new relationship or not, but in how you understand love itself. At this stage, love is no longer a place to fill a void, nor a negotiation of emotions. It does not arise from the fear of loss, it is not sustained by tension or insecurity, and it certainly does not require you to sacrifice yourself in order to maintain connection. In Jungian terms, this is the moment when love no longer operates from wound to wound, but from self to self. Before awakening, you loved from a lack you were not consciously aware of. You loved with the hope that if you were chosen, kept, prioritized, you would finally feel enough. That is why the relationship with a narcissist once felt intense, electrifying, yet profoundly unstable. After awakening, that intensity no longer seduces you, not because you have become closed off, but because your nervous system has learned a new language, safety. And mature love always begins with safety, not with chaos. At this stage, you no longer seek someone who makes you feel alive, because you are already connected to the life within yourself. You are no longer drawn to dazzling personas, grand promises, or excessive attention at the beginning. Instead, you sense very clearly what is unstable, what is rushed, what demands that you trade away your boundaries. This discernment does not make love less romantic, it makes love more real. Jung emphasized that true love is not fusion, but recognition. You see the other as they are, and you are seen as you are, without performance, without striving to be worthy. Here, love does not demand salvation, No one has to heal the other. Each person takes responsibility for their own shadow. And it is precisely this that creates a deep equality within the bond. What matters is this: love after awakening often arrives more slowly, more quietly, and without dramatic impact at the start. But it carries a quality you may never have known before: sustainability. You do not fear losing it, because you do not lose yourself if it ends. You do not cling to it, because you have learned how to remain with yourself. And for this reason, the relationship does not become the center of your existence, but a natural part of the rich life you are building. Part 7 does not promise a fairy tale ending, but opens a new way of loving, one in which you no longer love in order to be completed, but love from a wholeness that already exists. And within that space, whether you choose to remain alone or to enter a new relationship, love is no longer where you lose yourself. It becomes the place where you are allowed to be yourself, whole, free, and no longer required to sacrifice your soul in order to stay.